Just a bedpan nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer had said to the resident on Tuesday, his voice carrying the particular contempt reserved for people who wore scrubs but lacked the proper letters after their names. Hannah Clarke had been changing the linens in room 407 when she heard it through the cracked door, the words drifting down the hallway like contaminated air. She didn't pause. She didn't turn around. She simply finished tucking the corner of the sheet under Admiral Garrett's unmoving form with the same deliberate precision she brought to every task, every movement, every breath. 11 months she had worked the 4th floor of St. Michael's in Colorado Springs, and in that time she had learned to become invisible. The kind of invisible that came from understanding how institutions worked, how they sorted people into categories and never let them cross the lines, how they valued credentials above competence, how they protected their own and discarded everyone else. Hannah had become very good at being disposable. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it that never quite washed away, the faint copper edge of blood, the staleness of recycled air that had passed through too many dying breaths. She moved through that landscape like someone who belonged nowhere and everywhere at once, changing bedpans for patients who couldn't ask, sponge-bathing bodies that had forgotten how to respond, repositioning limbs with a care that the other nurses found excessive. There was no efficiency in gentleness. There was no profit in attention. Room 407 held Admiral James Garrett, 63 years old, 3 years in a coma after a cerebrovascular accident that had left him suspended between life and something that wasn't quite death. His daughter visited every Tuesday at 2 p.m., clicking across the tile floor in heels that matched her structured blazer, her face arranged into the expression of someone performing grief for an audience that didn't exist. Hannah learned her schedule within the first week. She learned to have the Admiral's bedding fresh, his skin clean, his hair combed before that appointment. The Admiral's brain didn't respond to external stimuli. That was the official consensus. That was what the chart said. But Hannah had learned to read the small things, the infinitesimal tightening of muscle when she repositioned his right arm, the way his pupils tracked slightly when she spoke during his morning care, the pattern of his breathing that changed when someone genuinely cared versus someone simply counting minutes until shift change. She used tactile stimulation during repositioning, a technique the other nurses dismissed as pointless gesture. Hannah didn't dismiss much. She used gentle pressure on specific nerve clusters while moving his limbs, maintaining his muscle tone with deliberate precision, keeping his body the way it had been trained to exist, ready, capable, waiting. Nobody asked why the Admiral's legs hadn't atrophied like typical coma patients. Nobody questioned why his hands remained uncurled and flexible. The medical staff saw what the charts told them to see. The elderly combat medic in room 315 saw something different. Sergeant Marcus Webb was 71 years old, recovering from pneumonia after a rough week that should have killed him. He'd been a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment during 4 tours in Kandahar, which meant he recognized things other people missed. He recognized the way Hannah approached the Admiral's body like it was a weapon that needed maintenance. He recognized the field-level efficiency in her movements, the way her hands never wasted motion, the way her fingers found specific anatomical landmarks like she was reading a map she'd memorized in blood. It was Thursday morning when Webb finally placed it. Hannah was in room 407, adjusting the Admiral's catheter line with a steadiness that suggested she'd done far more complicated things in far worse conditions. Her movements were economical and certain. There was no hesitation, no moment of uncertainty, just the smooth execution of someone whose hands remembered things her mouth would never say. Webb watched from his doorway across the hall, his breath still labored but his eyes sharp, and something ancient in his chest recognized what he was seeing. Special Operations Medic. The kind of medic who'd trained at SOCOM, who'd worked in denied areas, who'd held people together under fire using equipment that was never supposed to exist in the first place. He'd served with medics like that in Kandahar. He knew their signature, the absolute precision, the way they moved like they were operating in 3 dimensions instead of the normal world's 2. He didn't say anything to Hannah. Webb had learned long ago that people who existed in that particular category of work didn't need introductions or acknowledgments. They needed silence and the understanding that some truths had classification levels. But he watched her. And he waited. Dr. David Mercer arrived during morning rounds on Friday, his white coat precisely pressed, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a priest's vestments. He was 58 years old, the chief of internal medicine, the kind of man who had built his reputation on the foundation of believing that medical school was not just education but ordination. He had published 17 papers, chaired the ethics committee, and donated to St. Michael's enough money that his name was engraved on the East Corridor, Dr. David Mercer, class of '89. The medical hierarchy meant something to him. It meant everything to him. Hannah was adjusting Admiral Garrett's feeding tube when Mercer entered room 407, and the moment her hands came into his line of sight, something in his expression shifted. She was threading the tube with the kind of precision that suggested she'd done this particular procedure thousands of times, her fingers moving with absolute certainty while she monitored the monitor readings and the Admiral's respiratory response. She wasn't using the standard repositioning technique taught in nursing school. This was something else. This was something that looked practiced in ways that nursing school couldn't produce. Dr. Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. A muscle jumped once beneath his ear. "That's an unusual technique," he said. His voice was the kind of tool that had been sharpened by years of understanding its own power. Hannah didn't turn around. She finished the adjustment, checked the tube positioning one final time, and then set down her instruments with the same careful deliberation she brought to every action. "The standard repositioning causes microstress on the existing tissue," she said quietly. "This approach minimizes inflammation." It wasn't what he'd asked. It was the answer to a different question, the question of whether she knew what she was doing. Mercer didn't like that. He didn't like people who answered the question they chose instead of the one that was asked. "Where did you learn that?" "Trial and error," Hannah said. 11 months of noticing what worked and what didn't. She turned to face him then, and for a moment something flickered across her features, not fear, not defensiveness, just the briefest acknowledgement that she understood what was happening in that room. Mercer was the kind of man who solved problems by removing the variable he didn't control. He was beginning to view Hannah as a variable. "I see," he said finally. "Well, let's try to stick to the established protocols, shall we? St. Michael's has protocols for a reason." He said it the way people said things that weren't questions at all, but commands wrapped in the pretense of reasonable suggestion. Hannah simply nodded, her expression settling back into the careful blankness that had served her well, and began gathering her supplies. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't defend the evidence of her own competence. But Webb, watching from across the hall, saw her hands pause for exactly 2 seconds after Mercer left the room. He saw the way her fingers flexed once against the supply cart, like they were remembering something violent. And he understood. He understood that whatever Hannah Clarke was, whatever she had been, she was no longer supposed to exist. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with their mechanical constancy, indifferent to the small wars being fought beneath them, and the heart monitor in room 407 beeped its steady rhythm, the sound of a man suspended between the life he'd lived and whatever came next. Hannah finished her rounds with the same invisible efficiency she brought to every shift, and not a single person in St. Michael's Hospital understood that they were standing in the same corridor as someone the Pentagon had tried very hard to erase. Not yet. But Mercer was beginning to wonder. The Tuesday afternoon light filtered through the ICU windows in pale strips as Dr. Mercer positioned himself in the doorway of room 407, 2 residents flanking him like sentries. Admiral Garrett's daughter sat in the visitor's chair, her hands folded in her lap, unaware she was about to become an audience for a professional execution. Hannah was adjusting the Admiral's position, her movements fluid and precise, when Mercer's voice cut through the quiet hum of machines. "Nurse Clarke, perhaps you could explain your unorthodox repositioning technique to our visitors," he said loudly, each word calibrated to carry down the corridor. The other residents exchanged glances. This was theater, and they recognized the opening act. Hannah didn't pause mid-movement. Her hands continued their steady work, rotating the Admiral's shoulders with the kind of anatomical precision that came from understanding exactly how pressure distributed across immobilized joints. "I'm following best practices for coma patient care, doctor. Repositioning every 2 hours prevents bedsores and maintains circulation." "Best practices from where, exactly?" Mercer stepped closer, his voice pleasant, the way a predator sounds before it strikes. YouTube University? The Admiral's daughter flinched. One of the residents actually shifted his weight backward, suddenly uncomfortable. Hannah's jaw tightened, a single muscle contraction, brief as a blink, but her hands never wavered. The 4 lines she was checking remained steady as surgical steel. We've noticed our YouTube nurse here has some creative interpretations of standard protocols, Mercer continued, turning to the daughter with a smile designed to look fatherly. Tell me, Clarke, did your online certification cover the legal liability of experimental procedures on unresponsive patients? Unauthorized deviations from care plans can result in substantial negligence claims. The words hung in the air like poison gas. The Admiral's daughter's face went white. She looked at Hannah as if seeing a threat for the first time. Hannah finished documenting the Admiral's vitals in his chart. Her voice came out flat, without inflection, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has learned the exact frequency that makes authority figures uncomfortable. I'll review my documentation with you, Doctor. After my shift. She didn't say, sir. She didn't apologize. She didn't flinch at the accusation of incompetence or the implication that she was endangering a 3-year coma patient. She simply stated a fact and returned to her work. And somehow, that composure, that absolute refusal to crumble, seemed to infuriate Mercer more than any defensive argument could have. By that evening, the break room had become a minefield. Hannah pushed through the door at 5:45 p.m., her lunch container in one hand, and the room went dead silent. The nurse from cardiac care suddenly remembered she had rounds in ICU. The respiratory therapist's phone call became urgently important. The microwave timer provided a convenient excuse for someone else to flee. Within 15 seconds, she was alone in a room that had held 4 people. The sandwich was turkey and mustard, the bread already going stale. She ate it slowly, methodically, her face completely neutral as the fluorescent lights buzzed above her head like dying insects. Her knuckles whitened around the plastic container, the only visible indication that she was aware of what had just happened, that Mercer had orchestrated a synchronized exile, a coordinated silence from people she'd worked alongside for 11 months. She finished eating. Rinsed her container. Dried it with paper towels. Folded it into her bag. Then she stood and walked back to the ICU as if the past 10 minutes had never occurred. Thursday morning arrived with rain hammering the parking lot like applause. Hannah clocked in at 6, her scrubs still damp from the walk from her car. She was pulling up a patient chart when she saw it, her name on the public write-up board in red marker, the kind used for critical alerts and dangerous incidents. Clarke, failure to follow established protocols during patient care, unauthorized deviation from care plans. Report to Chief of Internal Medicine before next shift. 20 staff members pass that board every hour. Physicians, nurses, residents, patients' families waiting for elevators. And there, immortalized in red marker, was her professional competence reduced to a bureaucratic violation. Hannah read it once. Her eyes tracked across each word. Then she turned and walked back to the medication dispensary, her expression unchanged, though something shifted behind her eyes, not hurt, not fear, but recognition. This was the next move. This was how they buried people who didn't belong. She continued her rounds as if the board didn't exist. As if her name wasn't posted in the hallway like a warning. As if 20 years of work hadn't just been reduced to a single sheet of paper in red marker. She checked on Admiral Garrett at 7:15 a.m., listening to his breathing, confirming the ventilator settings, noting the slight rise and fall of his chest that meant a 3-year coma patient was still alive because someone knew exactly how to keep him that way. The Army sergeant in room 315 watched her from his bed as she passed in the corridor. His call button had never been important before, but he pushed it now, and when Hannah appeared in his doorway, he nodded once toward the public board. "They're scared of you," the old man said quietly. His voice sounded like 50 years of cigarettes and truth-telling. Hannah didn't answer. She adjusted his foredrip, checked his oxygen saturation, and documented his vitals. But something in the way she moved suggested she'd already heard worse accusations than cowardice. The morning stretched ahead with the weight of institutional machinery turning against her, and she met it the way she'd met everything else, with the kind of composure that came from having survived things that didn't officially happen. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 2:19 a.m. on Friday morning, when the fire alarm malfunctioned and triggered the sprinkler system on the 4th floor. Electrical equipment sparked and died in sequence, monitors first, then the overhead lights, then the ventilator attached to Admiral Garrett's chest. The sprinkler system had flooded the 4th floor with the precision of a bombing campaign, water cascading through ceiling tiles, pooling across the ICU beds, turning the sterile white corridor into a disaster zone. Alarms screamed. Nurses evacuated patients in controlled panic. The chaos was textbook and manageable, until 6:33 a.m. Monday morning when the Army sergeant in room 315 began coughing. His name was Marcus Webb. 73 years old, former E-7 combat medic, 18th Medical Group out of Kandahar province, now recovering from a simple pneumonia that he should have beaten in 3 days instead of 3 weeks. Hannah was checking his oxygen saturation, 92%, stable, acceptable, when he coughed. Not a normal cough. A violent, wrenching, full-body convulsion that came from somewhere deep in his thoracic cavity and wouldn't stop. His face went red. His hand grabbed her wrist. She saw it in the space of 2 seconds. The distended neck veins. The tracheal deviation, his windpipe shifting visibly to the right. The oxygen saturation plummeting on the monitor, 88. 81, 74. His fingertips turning blue. The look in his eyes shifting from confused to terrified to something worse, the clarity of a man who understood he was dying and was running out of time. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung creating positive pressure in the chest cavity, compressing his heart, restricting blood flow, killing him by inches while the entire hospital was dealing with fire alarm aftermath and water damage and administrative chaos. The on-call resident was still in surgery. The procedure cart with the chest tube kit was locked in the main supply room, 45 seconds away. 45 seconds he didn't have. Hannah's hands moved before her brain finished thinking. She pulled the emergency kit from the wall mount, the one meant for field bleeds and trauma response, and located the combat knife scalpel inside. Not a surgical scalpel. A field implement, the kind used by special operations medics in field thoracotomies when there was no time for OR protocols or sterilization stations or anything except the fundamental human mathematics of survival. She looked at Marcus Webb's face. She made her decision. "This will hurt," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. "Try not to move." She didn't wait for permission. She palpated his ribs, second and third intercostal space, mid-axillary line, and marked the spot with her thumbnail. The knife went in without hesitation. The blade found the intercostal muscles and separated them with the muscle memory of someone who had done this maybe 30 times before, in Kandahar, in the back of a Chinook, in a forward operating base where the nearest surgeon was 2 hours away by helicopter. Blood pooled instantly. The hiss of air escaping from his chest cavity was audible, the sound of pressure release, of a lung re-inflating, of a death sentence being commuted by 18 inches of surgical steel and hand steady as a surgical laser. She inserted the 28-gauge chest tube in a single fluid movement. No fumbling. No hesitation. No second guessing. The tube went into place and she sealed it to a one-way valve. His oxygen saturation began climbing. 74, 79. 84, 88. Her other hand was already on his shoulder, reading his pulse, assessing for shock, her vital signs taking his vital signs like two instruments calibrating each other. The attending resident found them like that, Hannah kneeling beside the bed, blood on her scrubs, one hand on the chest tube and another monitoring his carotid pulse, and Marcus Webb staring at her face with the kind of absolute certainty that only comes from recognizing something you thought had been erased from your life. His oxygen saturation had stabilized at 91%. His heart rate was dropping. He was going to survive. "Who did you call?" The resident's voice was thin, confused. He was looking at the chest tube like it had materialized from another dimension. "Nobody," Hannah said. There was no time. That's outside your scope. You can't. The resident stopped. He was looking at her hands. At the precision of the tube placement. At the fact that she had just performed a field thoracotomy with equipment meant for blood pressure monitoring and trauma triage. His face went very still, the way it does when someone recognizes they've watched a professional do something that only professionals are supposed to be able to do. "Where did you learn that?" he asked quietly. Hannah didn't answer. She was checking the tube placement, confirming the seal, her movements operating on a plane somewhere above the reach of conversation or explanation or any social requirement that didn't involve keeping a human being alive. Marcus Webb grabbed her wrist again. His oxygen saturation was 93% now. His color was returning. His eyes were locked on hers with the terrifying intensity of a man who had just seen something impossible clarified into absolute truth. "Kandahar," he gasped. "I know that technique. That's SEAL Team Medical. That's the protocol they used in," he coughed, caught himself, didn't finish the sentence. But he was looking at her like she was a ghost. Like she was someone who wasn't supposed to exist anymore. "You're operational medical. Real operational. Not civilian trained. Where did you serve?" The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum in the ceiling, and Hannah understood that this moment, this single moment of competence revealed in front of a witness who knew exactly what competence meant, had changed everything. She had let her hands answer instead of her lips. She had prioritized saving a life over staying invisible. She had made a choice that the Navy had ordered her never to make. "I'm just a nurse, Sergeant," she said. Her voice was calm. Measured. A lie told with the precision of someone who had been lying for 3 years. "Stay still. Let your lung re-inflate." But Marcus Webb wasn't looking away. 73 years old, former Army E-7, and he had just watched a nurse perform a field thoracotomy with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory layered across 30-plus emergency procedures in a combat zone. He knew. There was no unknowing it. The resident was still staring at her, his clinical mind trying to reconcile the procedure he'd just witnessed with the hospital employee handbook that explicitly prohibited nurses from performing anything beyond vital signs and patient observation. He was opening his mouth to speak when the intercom crackled. "All medical personnel to the administrative conference room. All medical personnel to the administrative conference room. This is not a drill." Hannah's breath didn't change. Her pulse didn't accelerate. She was still holding the chest tube sight, still monitoring Marcus Webb's respirations, still operating in the professional space where she kept herself sealed away from everything except the immediate physical reality of a patient who needed care. "You should go," Marcus Webb said. "That's for you." "I'm finishing this assessment," Hannah replied. But she was counting seconds. Counting the minutes until Dr. Mercer arrived with hospital administration, with documentation, with the folder he'd been carefully assembling for 6 months, every perceived violation, every questionable decision, every moment of competence that exceeded her credentials. She had just handed him the final chapter. She had just performed a procedure that was, by every institutional metric, a clear violation of her scope of practice. She had just saved a man's life in the most visible way possible, in front of a resident who would report it within 10 minutes, in front of an Army sergeant who would connect the dots between her technique and a classified unit that officially didn't exist. The silence stretched for another 30 seconds. Then footsteps in the corridor. Multiple footsteps. Administrative wait. Dr. Mercer's voice, tight with something that sounded like vindication, saying her name like it was already written in the termination paperwork he was carrying. Hannah finished recording Marcus Webb's vital signs. She entered the numbers into the chart with unhurried precision. She didn't look up when Dr. Mercer entered the room. She didn't flinch when she saw the folder, thick with 6 months of accumulated grievances, time-stamped incident reports, highlighted policy violations, witness statements from staff members who'd learned that associating with Hannah carried professional costs. "This is the final violation," Dr. Mercer said. His voice was tight. Contained. Like he was holding back something closer to triumph than concern. "She performed a chest tube procedure. without resident supervision, outside her scope of practice. Multiple violations of Joint Commission standards and Colorado Nursing Board statutes. Hannah set down her pen. She looked at the folder. She understood that this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when her invisible utility as a hospital employee ended and her vulnerability as a woman with erased credentials began. The Navy had ordered her to disappear. They had stripped her of her captain rank officially. They had told her to never surface under her real credentials again. And she had agreed because the alternative was worse. She should be terminated immediately, Dr. Mercer continued. He turned to the hospital administrator, a woman named Patricia Chen, who looked deeply uncomfortable with the authority she was being asked to exercise. For the safety of our patients and the liability of this institution, she needs to be removed from the premises. Hannah looked at Marcus Webb. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding between people who had survived things that official channels couldn't acknowledge. Between warriors operating in systems that didn't know how to categorize them. She stood up slowly. She unpinned her badge from her scrub top. She looked at Dr. Mercer's face and saw the satisfaction there, the professional victory he'd been assembling like a bomb for 6 months. She handed over her badge without a word. The plastic clicked against the hard surface of the table, that single sound like a period at the end of a sentence, like a door closing, like the end of something that had never been allowed to begin. "You're done here," Dr. Mercer said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The way someone speaks when they've finally won something they've been fighting for so long they'd forgotten it was a fight. Hannah grabbed her jacket from the locker room, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the only physical proof she'd ever been anything more than a disposable nurse, and walked out of St. Michael's at 7:23 a.m. on a Monday morning that would decide everything that came after. The sprinkler system triggered at 2:27 a.m., water cascading from ceiling fixtures like a broken sky, and Hannah was already moving before the alarm finished wailing. The 4th floor of St. Michael's dissolved into chaos, electrical equipment sparked where water found exposed wiring, monitors flatlined in synchronized surrender, and the ventilator keeping Admiral Garrett alive wheezed once and died. She didn't hesitate. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved on their own, grabbing the manual ambu bag from the crash cart, her fingers finding the proper grip, one hand sealing the mask to the Admiral's face, the other compressing the bag in steady rhythm. Breath. Oxygen flowing. Life maintained by hands that refused to let go. The Admiral's chest rose and fell with each compression, his body responding to her intervention the way it had responded to her care for 11 months, even while his mind remained locked 3 years in the past. "All patients evacuating to the south stairwell," she called out, her voice cutting through the alarm like a scalpel through tissue. To a nurse, "Maintain cardiac monitoring protocols, move now." The residents froze, unsure, looking for authority that should have come from somewhere else. She didn't wait for permission. Move. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and something in her tone, something in the sudden shift of her shoulders, the way her eyes swept the room like a general surveying a battlefield, made 3 nurses obey without question. They started moving patients, disconnecting portable monitors, supporting those too weak to walk on their own. Hannah kept bagging, kept breathing for the Admiral, kept him alive through sheer will and the technical precision that had once saved lives in a place that officially never existed. 20 minutes later, when the electrical surge was contained and the generators hummed back online, when Admiral Garrett was stable on backup ventilation and the 4th floor had been cleared of water and danger, Dr. Mercer arrived with hospital administration. He wasn't breathless from running. He wasn't concerned about patient safety or infrastructure damage. He carried a folder, meticulously organized, color-coded tabs visible, pages arranged with the precision of a prosecutor preparing for trial. His face had the expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, who had rehearsed this scene in his office mirror. "That's enough," he said to Hannah, his voice pitched to carry to the assembled staff. "Step away from the Admiral. Now." Hannah finished her current compression of the ambu bag, handed it smoothly to the respiratory therapist who was taking over ventilation duties, and straightened. Her badge was still clipped to her scrub top. Her hair was still in its regulation bun. She looked exactly like what she was pretending to be, an overqualified nurse who had stepped outside her lane one too many times. Dr. Mercer opened the folder with the careful solemnity of a judge pronouncing sentence. Multiple violations of established hospital protocol. Unauthorized assumption of physician authority during the emergency response. He held up a page, highlighted sections glowing yellow like infection under ultraviolet light. Directing licensed residents. Commanding staff without supervisory clearance. Performing patient assessment and intervention protocols outside the scope of registered nursing practice. Another page. 6 months of documented violations. Incident reports. Witness statements. He turned to the hospital administrator beside him, a grey man in a grey suit who looked like he'd been cut from the same institutional cloth as the folder itself. This constitutes a pattern of reckless endangerment and deliberate insubordination. The words fell like verdict, like judgment, like the closing of a door that had never really been open. Hannah listened without moving. Without flinching. Without the trembling that would have been appropriate, human, understandable. She'd spent 3 years learning not to react to the loss of her identity. She'd spent 11 months learning how to disappear inside a civilian life. She could absorb this without breaking because she'd already absorbed worse, the erasure of Captain Hannah Clarke from every Navy database, the dissolution of her service record, the conversion of her military decorations into classified footnotes in files that would never be declassified in any lifetime she would personally witness. Your credential review indicates you have misrepresented your qualifications and training, Dr. Mercer continued, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice like honey and poison. Your employment with St. Michael's is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. Your license is being reported to the Colorado Board of Nursing for investigation of fraudulent practice. The administrator extended termination paperwork printed on official letterhead, invoking Joint Commission regulations and state nursing board statutes, citing specific code sections designed to make her disappearance official and permanent. Hannah read none of it. She unpinned her hospital badge, the name tag that read H. Clarke RN in letters so small they were easy to miss, and set it on the counter beside Admiral Garrett's bedside. The plastic was warm from her chest. It left a small impression in her palm. I understand, she said, her voice level and measured and free of anything resembling defiance. The timid nurse. The unaccredited pretender. The fraud they decided she was. I'll cooperate fully with the investigation. Security arrived within minutes, 2 guards who looked uncomfortable with the task, who'd probably seen her in the halls 100 times, who'd watched her move through this hospital with the kind of competence that didn't require official credentials to be real. She didn't resist. She signed paperwork. She walked to the locker room. She gathered her personal effects into a cloth bag that had once held gym clothes she'd never actually used, maintaining the fiction of a normal life right up until the moment the fiction ended. The hospital laundry room was empty at 3:15 a.m., fluorescent lights humming overhead with the sound of 1,000 electrical impulses trying to maintain consciousness. Hannah stood alone among the washing machines and dryers, folding her scrubs one final time. The blue fabric was worn soft from 11 months of 12-hour shifts, 5 days a week, walking hallways she'd memorized and patients she'd learned to help. She pressed each crease with the same precision she brought to everything, the precision of someone who'd been trained by the United States Navy to operate in chaos and emerge with lives intact. The scrub smelled like antiseptic and her own skin, like the 11 months compressed into fabric, like the temporary identity she was now shedding like old skin. She pulled on her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, deep in the pocket where it had lived undisturbed for 3 years. The patch was barely visible unless you knew where to look, unless you understood what the worn embroidered edges represented, a Navy Medical Corps insignia, a SEAL team designation, a unit that officially didn't exist in any military database she could access. It was the only proof she'd ever been anything more than a nurse, the only physical evidence that Captain Hannah Clarke had been real once, had saved lives under fire in Kandahar, had earned decorations that couldn't be worn and commendations that couldn't be claimed. The truth was she'd been ordered to disappear after a classified operation went sideways 3 years ago. The operation had no name in public records. Operation Nightingale existed only in sealed files and the memories of the 17 wounded she'd extracted under fire, the 12 lives she'd saved with a combat knife and improvised field medicine, and the kind of training that never left your hands no matter how many years passed. The Navy had erased her service records, stripped her of her rank officially, given her a new civilian identity with matching documents and social security numbers and a cover story about attending nursing school in Arizona. They told her to disappear completely. To never surface under her real credentials again. To become someone disposable, someone forgettable, someone who could move through the world without triggering the classified alerts that would follow the real Captain Hannah Clarke. She'd chosen nursing because she couldn't stop healing people, even after everything was taken from her. Even after her identity was classified. Even after the government that had trained her to save lives told her to pretend she'd never served. The irony was bitter and sharp. She was trained as a field medic by the world's most elite military institution, and now she was being fired from a civilian hospital for practicing medicine without a license. The laundry room door opened. An orderly she'd never spoken to appeared with a hamper of soiled linens, saw her standing alone in the fluorescent hum, and froze. His eyes flickered across her face, the face of someone who'd been public enemy number one for the last 8 hours, and he quickly turned to leave, the hamper suddenly very urgent to deliver elsewhere. One more person who'd learned she was toxic to associate with. One more small abandonment in a life that had already been abandoned by her own government. Hannah placed her folded scrubs in the return bin. The fabric settled into the basket like a flag being lowered. She pulled on her jacket, felt the weight of the unit patch sewn inside, and walked out of the hospital. The exit doors opened onto a Colorado Springs night that was darker than it should have been, or maybe it was just that she was seeing it without the institutional lights filtering everything into clinical clarity. She didn't see the hospital's routine background check system flagging her classified file the next morning, the automated alert triggered by her security clearance pinging across classified networks at the Pentagon. She didn't see Admiral Garrett's eyes opening for the first time in 3 years, his consciousness surfacing from 3 years of darkness like a diver rising from the deepest water. She didn't hear his first words, whispered to the nurse checking his vitals, a single call sign that meant everything to the people who understood its weight, Nightingale. But that wasn't the worst part. The hospital's routine background check system flagged Hannah Clarke's file at 6:06 a.m. when her classified security clearance triggered an automated alert at the Pentagon. Nobody noticed at first. The system flag was designed to be silent, invisible to everyone except the 3 people authorized to see it. But by 7:15 a.m., the first call had come through to St. Michael's compliance office, a woman's voice, measured and official, asking for immediate confirmation of Hannah's employment status and current access levels. The compliance officer, Patricia Chen, had been handling routine healthcare credentialing for 18 years. She'd never heard that tone before. It was the tone you use when a situation has suddenly become very large. Admiral James Garrett opened his eyes at 2:33 p.m. that same afternoon. The nurse checking his vitals, a young woman named Sophia, fresh out of her BSN program, had been documenting his pupil responses to light when his eyelids moved. Not a reflex. Not a twitch. A conscious, deliberate opening of both eyes, the irises tracking her face with awareness that had been absent for 1,094 days. His lips moved. His voice, when it came, was barely more than breath, sandpaper against cotton, but the word was precise. Clear. Nightingale. Sophia froze. She'd read his chart. She knew he'd been unresponsive for 3 years. She'd never seen anything like this. She called for the resident. Then she called for the attending. By 3:15 p.m., 6 people surrounded his bed, running through neurological assessments, ordering imaging, trying to explain the medically impossible, that a brain that should have deteriorated into vegetation had somehow remained functional enough to recover full consciousness. What they didn't know was that consciousness had been returning for months, millimeter by millimeter, because Hannah Clarke had violated every protocol about end-of-life care, performing vestibular stimulation therapy that had no clinical authorization, using techniques that belonged to a classified military field manual, refusing to let his neural pathways atrophy the way comatose patients' brains were supposed to. She'd been fired 12 hours before he woke up. The Marine colonel arrived at 3:13 p.m. in full dress blues, medals arrayed across his chest like a military history textbook, there to pay respects to a Navy admiral who'd served 2 combat tours together. He was walking past the ICU corridor when he saw the commotion, staff members clustering around room 407, monitors chirping, someone running for a physician. He stopped. He turned. And he saw the name on the badge of a woman carrying charts toward the nursing station, Clarke. His face changed. He pulled out his phone, hands moving with the kind of focus that comes from certainty, and typed a search into a military database he wasn't supposed to have access to anymore. The screen loaded. The photo was 3 years old, hair shorter, uniform instead of scrubs, but the face was identical. The citation began to scroll. Captain Hannah Clarke, he read aloud, his voice lifting through the corridor with the clarity of someone accustomed to being heard. Navy Medical Corps. Silver Star Favela under fire during a classified operation in, he stopped, glancing down, because the rest of that sentence was redacted. But staff members had already stopped moving. A resident turned. A nurse looked up from her charting. The colonel continued, his voice steady, 3 Purple Hearts. Navy Commendation Medal. And a unit citation from the 160th Sawn Night Stalkers. He was reading louder now, because he couldn't quite believe what he was reading. Meritorious Service Medal. Bronze Star. And, he paused. There was something else, something that made the words catch. A Navy Cross. Dr. Mercer erupted from the physician's lounge the way a storm breaks, sudden, violent, without warning. He shoved through the gathering crowd, his face already reddening, his voice climbing to a register that made people step back. "That's stolen valor," he was saying, his words tumbling over each other. "That's a fraudulent military citation. A floor nurse with combat decorations." He turned to the colonel, his finger pointing like an accusation. "You're reading fake documents." She probably fabricated that entire database entry. She's been violating protocols since the day she arrived at this hospital, performing procedures without. The colonel closed his phone. He didn't raise his voice. "Did I stutter, doctor?" But there was something in that question, a particular weight that made Dr. Mercer's mouth close. The colonel's eyes were the color of weathered steel, and they were looking at Mercer the way a linebacker looks at a wide receiver who just fumbled the ball. "Stand down." The 2-star general arrived at 4:52 p.m. He parked his car in the emergency lot instead of the designated spaces. He didn't walk, he moved through the hospital with the kind of presence that made other people rearrange themselves to make room, the air pressure literally changing when certain people entered a space. His uniform was navy, his ribbons ordered in perfect ascending rank, and his eyes found Hannah in approximately 4 seconds. He walked directly to her. And he saluted. Not a casual gesture. A formal, regulation salute, arm at perfect 90 degrees, eyes locked forward, held for the full 3 seconds before he dropped his hand and said 4 words that ended whatever conversation Dr. Mercer had been trying to have. "Welcome home, Captain Clarke." He extended his hand. She shook it. And Mercer's face went from red to something closer to purple, his mouth opening and closing, no sound coming out, because you didn't salute a nurse unless the nurse was actually a captain, and you didn't salute a captain unless they'd earned every single rank, and you definitely didn't do it while the hospital's chief of internal medicine was standing 5 feet away screaming about fraud. The Pentagon liaison arrived 40 minutes later. She was wearing civilian clothes, a dark suit that fit better than most, and she carried a single briefcase. She didn't go to administration first. She went to Hannah. She pulled her aside, spoke 5 words, the call sign of the operation that had never officially happened, and Hannah's entire face changed. The composure shifted. Not broken, but recalibrated. The liaison produced a single document, 1 page, and Hannah read it with the kind of focus that made 3 nurses stop pretending to work. The word reclassified appeared twice. The word captain appeared in bold. The word compensation appeared at the bottom, followed by enough zeros to make the colonel's eyes widen when he glanced over. Cell phone videos had been recording the entire sequence. By 6:15 p.m., the first clip had uploaded to social media. Dr. Mercer's red face, his accusations, his voice climbing to a register that sounded almost hysterical, all captured in high definition while a two-star general stood in the background in full Navy dress uniform, patient and immovable, waiting for the civilian doctor to finish embarrassing himself. The comment sections filled with military veterans identifying the general, cross-referencing his public service record, confirming his authority to conduct what was clearly an official reinstatement ceremony. The second clip showed the salute. The third showed Mercer attempting to interrupt the liaison, his hand grabbing her arm, before security moved him away and the liaison simply continued speaking without breaking eye contact. By midnight, the videos had accumulated 2 million views. The hashtag was already trending, #Dr. Mercer gets called out. His medical school mentor was a retired Navy surgeon named Dr. Raymond Holloway, a man who'd served 3 tours in the same theaters where Hannah had done her work, a man who recognized what he was watching in those viral videos and couldn't look away. He called Dr. Mercer at 9:15 p.m., his voice steady but loaded with the kind of disappointment that cuts deeper than anger ever could. "I taught you medicine, Marcus," he said. "I didn't teach you cruelty." "She violated protocols," Mercer insisted, his voice rising defensively. "She performed procedures without proper credentials. That's dangerous, sir. That's criminal negligence. She saved lives with skills you couldn't match on your best day," Dr. Holloway replied. "And you tried to destroy her for it. You tried to destroy her because she made you look incompetent. Those viral videos are going to be shown in every medical ethics class for the next decade, and your name is going to be the example of what happens when arrogance replaces judgment." Pause. The kind of pause that carries the weight of finality. "I'm formally requesting that the medical board review your fitness for practice. Don't contact me again." The line went dead. Mercer stood in his kitchen holding a phone that was no longer connected, understanding, somewhere in the part of his brain that still functioned, that his life had just fundamentally changed. By Monday morning, the hospital's risk management team had completed their own audit. They pulled every complaint Mercer had filed against Hannah over her 11 months of employment, cross-referenced them against her patient outcomes, and discovered something that made Patricia Chen actually gasp when she read the summary. 0 adverse events. Highest patient satisfaction scores in the entire ICU. Better recovery metrics than nurses with 5 times her tenure. And every single complaint Mercer had filed corresponded with a moment when Hannah's competence had either exceeded his or contradicted his medical judgment. The nurses he'd convinced to provide witness statements against her were recanting those statements now, horrified by the viral videos showing exactly how orchestrated the campaign against her had been. The Admiral's daughter filed a formal complaint describing how Mercer had publicly questioned Hannah's qualifications while her father was unconscious and fighting for his life. Sergeant Marcus Webb, the Army combat medic from Room 315, gave a detailed statement describing how Hannah's field thoracotomy, the procedure Mercer had called a dangerous violation of protocol, had prevented him from dying of tension pneumothorax while hospital bureaucracy caught up. The statement was medical and precise, but the emotion underneath was unmistakable. He was describing how a nurse had saved his life. The hospital board met in emergency session on Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday evening, Dr. Mercer's suspension was announced. By Thursday, his medical license was under formal review. By Friday, his wife had retained a divorce attorney, his colleagues had stopped returning calls, and the medical community, which was far smaller and far more connected than it should have been, was actively spreading the word that Marcus Mercer was toxic, that his career was over, that there were positions available in rural clinics where he could drive supply vans and restock inventory and slowly fade into the kind of obscurity that felt like punishment and was probably deserved. 6 months later, Hannah stood in her Navy dress uniform for the first time in 3 years. The ceremony was at the Naval Air Station in Colorado Springs. Admiral Garrett promoted to a position that would take him to the Pentagon, his recovery attributed to revolutionary neurorehabilitation techniques that nobody could quite specify but that everyone agreed had defied medical expectation. Hannah stood at parade rest while the Admiral pinned his new rank insignia, and the Silver Star hung on her chest beside her Navy Cross, beside her Purple Hearts, beside every medal that had been erased from her records and was now being formally restored. The light caught the decorations, and someone in the audience, a retired Master Chief Petty Officer who'd worked with JSOC for 20 years, actually teared up watching her stand there, finally allowed to be seen, finally permitted to carry the weight of her own service in public. Dr. Mercer was loading supplies into a medical van in the parking lot outside St. Michael's Hospital. The work was precise, methodical, the kind of thing that required focus and offered no room for thinking about anything else. He didn't look up as Hannah walked past in her uniform. And she didn't acknowledge him. Her composure was absolute. There was no victory in it, no satisfaction, just the simple fact of her forward momentum while he remained stationary, loading boxes into a vehicle that smelled like diesel exhaust and regret, his career reduced to this, his future calculated in supply routes and second chances that nobody was actually offering. That evening, Hannah sat in her apartment in Colorado Springs and pulled out the jacket she'd worn for 11 months at St. Michael's. The faded unit patch was still sewn inside the lining, the way it had been since Kandahar, a piece of nylon and thread that represented 3 years of service that had almost been erased completely. She held it in her hands, and for the first time since she'd arrived at that hospital, she allowed herself to smile. Not a professional smile. Not a composure smile. A real smile, the kind that comes from understanding that the worst is actually behind you, that invisibility is finally over, that the world can see you now and you don't have to hide anymore. The Admiral's daughter had sent a framed photograph the week before, Hannah in her nurse's scrub standing beside the Admiral's hospital bed the day before the fire alarm incident, the two of them together, the Admiral's eyes open and aware, her hand on his shoulder. The note was handwritten, "You never stopped fighting for him when everyone else saw a lost cause." Hannah placed that photo on her desk beside her military commendations. The Army sergeant from room 315 texted her that same evening. His pneumothorax had healed completely. He was returning to full duty. The message was simple: nightingales don't abandon their wounded. We don't forget. Hannah typed her response carefully, the words coming from some place deeper than protocol or procedure, some place that understood sacrifice and service and the particular weight of carrying other people's lives. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most, she wrote, and hit send. She looked at her reflection in the window, no longer hiding, no longer erased, finally permitted to be both the captain she'd earned and the nurse she'd chosen to become. 2 titles. 1 person. Finally allowed to be whole. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you actually carried, if you've ever had to hide who you really were to survive a system that wasn't designed to protect people like you, Hannah's story might matter to you. Subscribe to this channel for stories about the people nobody sees, the ones doing the real work in the places where it counts. Like this video if you believe competence should matter more than credentials. And comment, what would you have done if you were Hannah?